So moving on then in Spengler to Chapter 8, which is Music and Plastic Part 2, Act and Portrait. A footnote here says that act, the German word Akt, also means nude, in addition to pose. It means pose as well as nude. So it has the connotation of the Greek nude versus the Faustian portrait study, which is going to be the basic opposition that he's going to discuss in this chapter, which is his second chapter on the arts of form, and contains all the rest of what he has to say on music and sculpture and painting. But before getting to that, what I'd like to do, since he talks about the image of the Virgin Mary in this chapter as one of the main, if not the main image, the Mary with the Christ child is the main image of Western Faustian civilization, because it has to do with becoming and time. The mother is time, she is destinies and space and becoming. I want to make reference to, there are medieval German wooden sculptures of Mary. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of that I've seen that shows the Virgin Mary with her belly that has a hinge in the center of it for these two little doors, and if you open up the two little doors, you can see inside of her womb there's an image of Christ nailed to the cross on the inside of her womb. And that, it seems to me, is the image that sums up Western Faustian civilization better than just about anything else you can imagine. We are a vagina-centric civilization. Our entire civilization revolves around that vagina in that sense, in just the same way that we can think of the Greeks revolving around the phallus. Everything about Greek culture is phallic. The columns, the rigidity, the statues, and in the Dionysus cults, the phallus itself actually was worshipped. And the same thing, I think, can be said of Indian civilization, which with its lingam cults, its Shiva cults, is also phallocentric, although the goddess does play a very strong role there. There's no question of that. The thing about that is, though, is that in India, the goddess cults come there rather late. For about the first 1,000 years of the culture, it's really a masculine dominant culture where the god Shiva provides the primary symbolism. Also, though, that in the case of Egypt, I think we can also consider Egypt, like the West, as a vagina-centric civilization. The image of the sky is of the sky as a mother. The goddess Nut is the image of the heavens. And in a way that is similar to this image of the Christ as an embryo inside the mother womb of Mary, you have the idea, the Egyptians have the idea, that the Pharaoh, when he is placed in his, wrapped up and mummified and placed inside of his sarcophagus, he is being put back into the womb of mother space. The lid of the sarcophagus was analogized to the body of Nut, the sky goddess, and the bottom part of the sarcophagus was meant to represent Jeb, the earth god, her consort. And so when the Pharaoh is put back in there and the lid placed upon it, it's exactly the same image as Mary with the Christ embryo inside of the womb. The Pharaoh is reduced to the status of a womb, of an embryo rather, inside of a womb. And when we think of the pyramids, they're basically pregnant mounds. They're basically analogized to a pregnant mother with the Pharaoh as reduced to the status of an embryo on the inside, because he's going to be reborn in the afterlife as a Sahu, a star being, where he will go up and become one of the stars that twitter around like birds. Sometimes they're analogized to swallows that fly around the central pole star, Thuban as it was known in those days, which never set below the horizon. And because it never set, the pole star from that latitude is always visible above the horizon, since the entire sky turns around it. And the other stars, like Orion, set and rise, and it's consequently Orion, which took 72 days to re-arise, was analogized to Osiris. And the pole star then is where the Pharaoh went when he became one of these stars. So that too is a vaginal-centric civilization. Of course, we know that women played a very strong role in Egypt. Several of them were pharaohs, Hatshepsut, as well as several others. And so in the case of Western Faustian civilization, I think it even becomes interesting and perhaps somewhat comical, I suppose, when we think about the opposition between, as Spengler puts it in this book, between classical civilization and Faustian civilization. He says are the two civilizations which have the greatest magnetism for each other. And when you think of the phallic aspect of classical civilization, and he says that the prime symbol of Faustian civilization is infinite space, and space is basically the mother, as it is in India, where it's called Maya. Maya is mother space that gives birth to forms. basically it's a female image. It's a gigantic womb image, and so there is a kind of weird sexual attraction there, evident even in the iconography. And of course, the cathedrals themselves, Notre Dame, our mother, were meant to be gigantic womb images, inside which Christ was again to be regarded as an embryo. And some of the entrances, if you look at the entrances on some of the facades, as in the case of Chartres, they are shaped like vaginas, the actual entrances to the cathedrals. And that's, I believe that to be intentional, actually. Then we have the rise in popularity of the Virgin Mary cults in the 12th and 13th centuries at the same time that these cathedrals are being built. And then we also have the phenomenon, of course, as everybody knows, of the troubadours and the minnesingers, who all sing about the love for a particular woman, which motivates them to perform great deeds. We have Lancelot is motivated to perform everything he does by his love for Guinevere. And Gawain he's a ladies' man who's always trying to get somewhere with women, no matter what he does and whatever situation he's in. So even the great Grail questers in that literature are themselves motivated by this numinous fascination for the female, in and unto herself, as a self-sufficient entity. The Grail itself, the quest for the Grail, is interesting because the Grail itself is a womb image. It's actually vaginal in terms of its semiotics. And as Jessie L. Weston remarked in her book From Ritual to Romance, it was regarded as a fertility symbol, a female fertility symbol, and the spear of Longinus that pierced the side of Christ, which in some of the Grail myths is involved, and Wagner certainly makes use of these two in his version of the Grail myth in Parsifal, are the spear, of course, being phallic and the cup being vaginal. And the two put together regenerate the crops, bring rain to the wasteland, and it's an image of fecundity. But notice that the quest for the Grail is the central iconic image of the mythos of Western Faustian civilization. It's the quest for the womb itself, the very image of it. And indeed, Spengler calls our civilization Faustian, and we know that in the myth of Faust, Faust is primarily motivated in his deeds by his love for Gretchen, for a woman. So she is the secret image there that's actually driving Faust to seek the ultimate moment, that moment that he would wish would not ever pass away and would just remain forever. And which does finally come to him, actually, at the end of Faust Part 2, with the image of Gretchen as she's carried up into heaven by all of these angels. That becomes the one transcendent moment of his life. So Western civilization is the goddess civilization par excellence. I think this may come as a surprise to some people, but when you think about the symbols and the images, it's pretty well grounded and backed up. And it is the one civilization, I think, in history in which women have done better and have been more highly regarded than in any other civilization in history. So all the feminists in our schools who rail about masculine dominance and exploitation are just missing this. They're missing that they're living in the one civilization that revolves around the vagina as its greatest numinous image, and is the one civilization that values the female as its highest ideal, as its motivating inspiration. And so women have done very well in this society as a result, and have not done as well in any of these other civilizations, not even in Egypt. There was a lot of, despite the goddess cults in Egypt, there was a lot of masculine dominance there and a lot of hatred for women in some cases that's very well documented. I think they've done better in Faustian civilization than in Egyptian civilization. And what leads into this discussion then is Spengler's discussion in this chapter about the icon of the Mary image, which appears in our case during the 12th century, and which is an image of time and becoming. The image of Mary with the Christ child on her lap. The child is the image of the future, and he says the woman herself symbolizes time, destiny, becoming, the future. And it's essentially woman as mother here that's the valued archetype. And he says that this is to be contrasted with the way women were generally regarded in classical civilization when they were not invisible, that is, as they were for the most part. In the myths and in the myths and the epics, they were primarily valued as either Amazons or purely as sexual objects, as Venus temptresses, and were not valued as a high ideal to be obtained. And the whole myth of the Trojan War being motivated by Helen is, of course, as we know, a fiction, and it isn't the point of the war at all. The point of the war is the gaining access to the entrance to the Black Sea for trading purposes. The myth that it was motivated by Helen was a much later secondary elaboration. So the woman, he says, the valuation of Mary is the basic image of the Faustian sense for the becoming aspect of things. And by the use of the word portrait, he means to refer to the fact that the primary myth of the Western Faustian civilization is the myth of the individual as a species unto himself, who is in a process of becoming through time. All our fascinations with portrait studies and painting bear this out, he says, and this is to be contrasted with Greek sculpture, act, the nude, where the sculpture represents always a single moment, one act. Myron's disc thrower is captured in the moment just before he's about to release the disc and throw it. Or the Nike of Samothrace, which alights on the edge of the ship, with the robes are still in the process of fluttering. It's just one single slice, as though it were a frame removed from a movie strip and turned into a work of art. And then he says that the images of the faces are always masks in Greek art. They're just masks. They're very impersonal. They're very lifeless. They do not admit of an interior soul. And they're not confessions or references to a life history. Not even when, in the Hellenistic period, they start doing portrait sculptures of actual living individuals. Even when they're doing that, like in the portrait bust of Sophocles, for instance, they're always casting the individual as a type. The individual as the serious orator, for example. It's always a type that they are representing in all of their works. All of their sculptures are basically masks, and they are, as such, basically two-dimensional. They don't have character depth to them the way that the Faustian civilization does, with its whole idea that the individual and his life history is the metaphysical revelation of the civilization par excellence, and the woman is the image that powers this, that is the, like Henry Adams says, with the Virgin and the dynamo replaces the Virgin technologically because the Virgin was the motivating image of the entire civilization. It's what brought the cathedrals up out of the ground and inspired the whole thing from the get-go. And so Spengler then also goes back and he says, you can even see the origins of this when you go back to look at the evolution of Western languages during the Merovingian period, when we can see the formation of the personal pronoun I. In German this is ich, in French it's je. You can see this, it's separated out, the personal pronoun I is separated out from the verb for the first time in history during the Merovingian period, and actually Franz Borkenau in his book End and Beginning traces this back to the 5th century AD, right at the end of it, to an inscription on a Scandinavian work of art found in Norway, where it says, I, Hrengir, or Hrothgar, or whatever his name is, own this. And that's the first occurrence of the personal pronoun I, and it came out of the Scandinavian North. And you can already see that. With that separation of the personal pronoun from the verb, you can already see that the essence of the West is going to center around the self, the subjectivity. You can also already see the origins of private property coming out of this. So that's Spengler's opening discussion in this chapter. And then he contrasts, he says, even if you contrast the sculpture of the cathedrals, this already appears, this inward emphasis on the individual personality already appears in the wonderful sculptures on the facades of the cathedrals. You can already see that the emphasis is always on the face, and the whole character of the individual is carved on the faces, and there's a lot of elaborate time and care put into those faces, the exact opposite of Greek sculpture, where all the emphasis and the accent is put on the body, not the head. The head is the secondary thing. This becomes evident, too, in the way that clothing is used in the two. In Gothic sculptures, the clothes are designed to hide the body and to emphasize all the more so the head sitting on top of it, as in the cathedrals of all the biblical figures adorning the portal at Chartres, for example. To contrast that with the fact that clothing as it's used in Greek sculpture is very light and airy, and it's there all the more so to emphasize the contours and sensuousness of the actual physical body itself. And then he says if you look at these early sculptures, that Claus Sluiter's Moses, for example, you can already see him brooding about destiny and fate, and there's a whole character there. There's a whole portrait study already going on there in the Gothic artwork and relief work and freestanding sculpture long before it first appears in the painting near the end of the 15th century with Giovanni Bellini's Doge Loredano, which Spengler says is the first great Faustian oil portrait, and also the portraits of Jan van Eyck, who, middle of the 15th century, in the north is also working out the fascination of the human individual, the face, and then also the hands. Those are the two things emphasized in Faustian portraits. Titian does a great job on this, and right down to the time of